Ngalakin Khadijan Nyunga Boja.
Good afternoon. I think we'll make a start. I'm Kadambod Siddiq, the director of the UWA Institute of Agriculture. Before we get started, I'm very happy to report that today's event is sold out. However, due to COVID-19 restrictions, you will see that lecture theatre is a little less crowded than usual because we were told the strict quota we have to keep. Please remember to follow social distancing recommendations, as you all know. It is customary for the University of Western Australia to acknowledge that it is situated on the Noongar land and the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. I am pleased to see a number of familiar faces in the audience. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Don Stewart and Stewart family, Honorable Colin D. Gressa, MLA Member for Agriculture, Parliament of Western Australian Legislative Council, Dr. Terry Enright, the Chair of the UWA Institute of Agriculture Industry Advisory Board, Dr. Norm Halls, former Director General of the then Department of Agriculture, Dr. Alec Campbell, currently the Chair of the Crawford Western Australian Committee, Professor Tim Colmer, Deputy Vice Chancellor Research, University of Western Australia, Emeritus Professor David Lindsay, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the University of Western Australia, I wish to welcome you for the 2020 Hector and Andrew Stewart Memorial Lecture. That's what we were able to unearth. So you can see that Hector Stewart and also Andrew Stewart. So this year marks the 27th lecture with the inaugural event held in 1966. The lecture is in honor of the late Honorable Hector J Stewart, MLC, his son, late Mr Andrew Stewart. Both were Wagin wool growers, so that's very important, so good agriculture connection. In 1921, Hector Stewart was elected to represent the southern provinces as a country party member of the Legislative Council. Following year, Hector, together with several of his colleagues, refused to accept an increase in his parliamentary salary, which is now not heard. We want more salary, right? In 1923, the money was given to the University of Western Australia and was used in part to establish these memorial lectures. His son, Andrew Stewart, was president of UWA's Guild of Undergraduates and twice the dean of UWA's then Faculty of Agriculture. As published in Countryman in 1959, his students saw him, in inverted commas, a friend and an advisor, as well as a limitless source of knowledge on all branches of agriculture. The Stewart family have continued his devotion to agriculture education through the strong support of the memorial lectureship. Again, Don and the family, they topped up the bequest fund, which was originally established about a few years ago, which is helping us to generate enough income to have this lecture series annually. If you look at the history of the lecture series, you can see that from 1966, sheep fertility and research. Graeme, what are you doing? Still continuing the sheep fertility and research. So as David Lindsay and so on. So I don't think we have sorted out the problem, but in a different aspect. We also looked at war against weeds, for example, soil health to global food security and so on. So they are the lectures. In 1999, I don't know, after that there was no lecture for a long time. So when I was selected for this position, then Vice Chancellor Alan Robertson said, you have a KPI to meet. One of the KPIs is to go and meet with the family members. And then I remember the late Dr. Andrew Stewart, who tragically passed away a few years ago in an accident, bicycle accident in New Zealand. He was a champion. He has been very helpful. So I do remember him. I'm sure that he will be watching this lecture from above heaven. I'm now very pleased to introduce Dr. Graeme Robertson. Graeme is a graduate of this university, University of Western Australia. He completed his PhD at the University of Oxford in plant physiology. And Graeme is the only, just remember this, only one Rhodes Scholar in agriculture to date in the 100 years of this university. So that's a great remark, and he's working very hard with the Rhodes Scholar Group and in Western Australia, that chapter. After completing a PhD in plant physiology, he worked on faba beans and boron toxicity at Oxford. He returned back, and then he joined the Department of Agriculture and into marketing, economics, led 5 years of that. He also worked in Meriden Dryland Institute, then had a time in Kimberley, the Frank Weiss Institute. The salinity crisis of the 70s saw Graeme appointed as the Commissioner of the Soil Conservation and Director of the Resource Management, where he played a major role in developing the land care movement at that time. So my first meeting with Graeme was, I was a junior research officer at the Department of Agriculture in B Block. So those days we had only one car and no mobile phone. So my wife come to pick me up, but she doesn't know how to communicate with me because there's no mobile phone. So she come upstairs and get lost in that maze of offices, those who have been to the Department of Agriculture. So she ended up instead of the B block upstairs, she ended up in D block and then wander around with a little girl. And then Graeme works late hours. And Graeme brings my wife and said, "You young man, why are you sitting here and doing the work late hours?" I said, "What are you doing here?" So that was the beginning. And then, of course, when Graeme became the Deputy Director General, we had a number of interactions. I do remember one occasion Graeme said, "Let's go to Meriden and look at your research at the Meriden Dryland Institute." And Graeme said, "I'll take my car, you drive all the way up to Meriden. On the way back, I'll drive." But we had a lot of arguments. With Graeme, you just have to start arguing. He argues a lot of things. You argue back. And he finally agreed. And when he left me at the South Perth, about 10:30 or something p.m. night, he said, "Look, don't take it personally. I'm a devil's advocate." So what did I say? "Graeme, I'm a devil." So Graeme was the Director General of the Agriculture for 10 years before accepting the position of Director of Muresk Institute of Agriculture, Professor and Head of Environment and Agriculture at Curtin University. He has done a lot of work there, reshaping the institute and then integrating that with the current Curtin University. He has worked in agriculture nationally and internationally and sat on many boards, committees and working groups, including inaugural chair of the Land and Water Resource Research Development Corporation and board member of the Grain Research and Development Corporation. Since leaving Curtin, Graeme helped to develop national strategies for agriculture research, education and training, and food security in several countries in North Africa, particularly in Morocco, Oman, and the Middle East. In his lecture today, Graeme will examine the reality of food security in Western Australia, what we produce, what we export, and what future risks there are to our production. Welcome, Graeme. And I'm sure that I told Graeme, be strong, just to criticize everyone. You don't need to worry about the ministers. You don't need to worry about the government system or the university. So please welcome Graeme.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Sadiq. The bio that I gave Sadiq was much shorter than that. Ladies and gentlemen, special guests, and the Stewart family, it's indeed a pleasure and an honour to be here today. I'm incredibly nervous, which most people won't believe. But when I really thought about it, I really shouldn't be nervous, because the expectations shouldn't be particularly high. You've got a list of incredibly eminent people that have spoken here, and most of the reality as to why I'm here today is due to COVID, because they just couldn't get anyone else to come.
That's not true.
So I'm just going to. It's a little bit of observations today. It's some of the things that I think are important that I've seen over recent times, and so it's a bit like driving in a car and looking out the window. We'll talk about some things and what I see is important in Western Australian agriculture, and what some of the issues are that we need to tackle. I've had a long interest in food and agriculture, and you really try and work out why, because I've got no farming background at all in the family, except my father used to admit to stealing apples from a farm near where he lived in Scotland. But apart from that, that's the only farming background we had. But I did start when I was 11 or 12, delivering pamphlets for the local supermarket throughout with 3 other young kids throughout Brentwood and Mount Pleasant. So you knew what was on sale and what was on special that week. I then graduated to working at the checkout, packing boxes as they were there for people to take their groceries home, and we used to call them tills in those days. And then I got promoted to working on the weekends in the food and the vegetable section, where they used to weigh out what people wanted and give them to them. So I got to know what a ripe pumpkin looked like, and I could tell someone that this is going to be a really, really good one. So a career in agriculture followed almost by accident. I've been incredibly fortunate in that I have spent a lot of time over my 40-odd years working in agriculture, visiting and getting involved with activities in overseas countries. And I've learned a lot about agricultural production systems and a lot about the food supply chains. More recently, I've been privileged to be involved in food security planning in particular, but research and development in agriculture to try to improve food security in a number of countries, as Sadiq mentioned. I didn't know much when I first started in Oman, involved with the food supply chain there and developing the food security plan. And I recall distinctly after my first meeting, 12 hours off the plane, the director of the Omani Department of Food Reserves and Food Storage told the guy that was in charge of the program that he needed to put me in a dish lap for a week and wander around the streets, and I'd get to understand what food security was all about, because he thought I was being a bit flippant about supplies. So I just want to talk a little bit about food security in general. I've probably got that here as well. And there is a global definition of food security, and it really is about all people having access to food, but not only food. It's got to be nutritious food, it's got to be suitable to their lifestyle, and it's got to be culturally suited as well. So countries that are vegetarian, obviously their food, it needs to be provided. It's got to be acceptable to them. The food security, when we analyse it, we look at 4 characteristics. And the first one is the availability. And the first thing is the food somewhere. Is there somewhere in the world that's got the wheat that we want? The second thing, is it accessible? Can we go and get it or bring it home, or is it in the paddock just down the road? The utilisation of it, and this is something that I knew not much about, but it's critical in a lot of countries. The food has got to be healthy, and it's got to be nutritious, and it's got to not be wasted, and it's not got to be not overconsumed. And so many of the countries that I've worked in, overconsumption of food, like it is in Western Australia, is a problem. But in some of the Middle Eastern countries, despite the fact they don't seem to have a lot of food, diabetes and pulmonary diseases, etc., are very important. Stability is the fourth one. We got the price is stable. It's where people go to the shops, so they're going to know what the price of eggs are today, and that's a critical issue when you've got challenging food supply chains and there's disruptions in them, and the prices can go up and down. And the food crisis of 2007, 2008 really focused the minds of people in many countries around the world about the stability of food supply. Food security is important to a large part of the world, and again, it surprised me how many people import so much of their food. So countries like Oman and Kuwait and UAE, Saudi and Singapore, etc., import 90% and more of all their food, and so it's a critical issue within their country. The governments accept responsibility for ensuring that there is food security, because particularly if you are an elected government, you're not going to be there too much longer if the people don't have food. Most or many countries of the world have a Minister for Food Security and a department responsible for it, and they have strategies and plans, and that's one of the things that I've been involved with, is developing those strategies and plans. There's monitoring and control. There's inspection to make certain the right amount of food is in the country, and the public confidence. There needs to be public confidence that food is available all the time, or you end up with really strange behaviours. And we're now all very familiar with that. When we had the first COVID, that people stockpiling baked beans and toilet paper, that if people think food supplies are not stable, you get a very strange system in the retail. So food security in Australia is not something we think about much, although the word has been in the press quite a lot recently, but particularly associated with the impact of COVID on the economic capacity of people to purchase food. But it's not really thought about at a government level at all. Although I did hear I think the Prime Minister mention the words a few days ago. So because food security is not an issue, we are not able to put ourselves, just as I was when I first went to Oman, in the position of the people that are not food secure. So the recent issue with the Al Kuwait boat and because of COVID on the boat, the sailing was delayed, and then Australia said, well, it can't sail, was an incredibly big issue in Kuwait, because that was more than a week's supply of mutton, which was actually programmed. It's not accidental, someone's just importing it. The government's there with a licence to the importer that this is what you're going to bring, and you're going to bring it this time, and you have to do it. It eventually sailed, and the meat got there before they had to resort to some pretty awful stockpiles of frozen mutton that they've got there. But it's just a classic case, is that no one, not at any at that time was it mentioned that this was a food security issue for Kuwait. You can argue about whether we should ship live animals or not ship live animals, and I'm very much of the view that in the middle of summer over there you shouldn't take live animals. In fact, no one should go there at that time of the year. It's so bad. So, but once you agree to do something, you've got to, we have to understand that we're supplying something to a market that has an expectation, and it is planned. It's not just there's been a shipment of fresh fruit into the marketplace. A similar issue, and there's been others in between, but the Australian export ban of live cattle to Indonesia is exactly the same sort of thing. That was a supply chain that had the government had given licences. The numbers of animals going in were strictly controlled by the Indonesian government. They were going to a particular market in the hospitality sector, and a significant part of it, basically all the trimmings, including the hoof and the skins and the fat and everything, was being put straight in the abattoirs in Java, straight to the wet markets, where the women would walk to it, put their arm in up to there to make certain it was warm, because if it was warm they could buy it, because the bacteria hadn't grown that much. So it was feeding a lot of people, and all of a sudden we stopped that overnight. It was a very significant shipment of animals going into the feedlots that that were going into those markets. We didn't think about the issue of what the food security meant. Now, most countries relying on food imports have established food reserves, and this is a really challenging issue, because how do you get a reserve? How big should it be? Where should it be? And when you have a reserve, most food products are perishable to some extent. You've actually got to turn it over. So how do you manage to turn over a stockpile when you've kept it as a reserve? You've obviously got to have it in the supply chain somewhere. Now, many countries that I've been involved with put their stockpiles, have developed stockpiles of everything. You know, and when I say everything, it's from sardines to grains, to meat, to tinned fruit, to everything. They've got everything in stockpiles. And then they think, well, we can't keep this stockpile. We've got to turn half of it over because it's getting out of date. If that just then gets dumped into the supply chain, it's absolute chaos in the market. And so, talking to traders in a place like Oman, where that sort of thing was happening on a 2-3 monthly basis, where rice was getting dumped into the market or tinned fish were getting dumped into the market, it's impossible for the private sector supply chain to work properly. Good practice and increasing practice is to have that's reserved within the supply chain. So it's pretty easy if the government is the sole importer of wheat, because the government has it in the wheat, and then it slowly puts it out to the millers and the wholesalers and whoever might have it. It becomes a bit more challenging with others, but there's some terrific examples around, and two that just immediately come to mind is Singapore, which imports 100% of its rice. It wants enough reserves for 3 to 4 months in the country at all times. It decided to establish, to pay for state-of-the-art storages for rice, but it didn't own 1 grain of rice that was in it. When it gives an export licence to someone to import rice, they have to have a certain tonnage in that store all the time. So they can bring their rice in, put it in the store, take out the old stock and put that into the marketplace. Oman did a very similar thing with oil, that it's got a big vegetable oil refiner that imports and exports, so they put some extra storage in place for the manufacturer to fill it up and have 3 months reserves of vegetable oil within the country. Now, fuel security is absolutely critical to food security. You need it for just about everything. And Australia has been an incredible laggard in meeting its fuel security needs, and also some commitments it's made internationally to how much fuel it will keep in reserve. So it was quite stunning to me a few months ago when I read that the Australian government was going to establish its stockpiles and meet its international obligations of fuel, and it decided to spend $94 million to buy some crude oil from the Gulf of Mexico and put it into storage in the US. Now, it did get heavily criticised in the press, but it didn't make any sense whatsoever. I mean, what good to us is crude oil sitting in storage in the US? If we need it, it's not going to be able to get there. If there is instability in the region with shipping lanes blocked, kiss it goodbye, and the Americans would take it anyway. Particularly Mr Trump would have. And if we did get it to Australia, we have incredible limited supply of capacity. And for instance, most of our diesel and most of our jet fuel is imported. So it didn't make any sense. Now, I don't know whether the government had planned this all along or whether it just suddenly came up. But a few months later, in September, they did announce an additional alternative strategy. I don't know what they've done with the crude oil in the US, but they've actually decided to do exactly what Oman's doing with vegetable oils and Singapore's doing with rice. That's putting storage facilities within the current import terminals or the refineries, and asking those to, filling them up initially, and then asking those oil industry people to turn those stocks over and use them. So, to me, I just thought, well, that's just a classic. That there's not, the government is just not thinking, hasn't been thinking about what security, food security or fuel security really means. So it brings me to, that's just a general view of food security, and it's very interesting, and it's amazing how food insecure the world is, and of course COVID has increased the food insecurity in a large part of the world as supply chains have been disrupted, and some of the agricultural operations have not been able to work. Australia is very food secure. There's a food security index that's published every year by the Economic Intelligence Unit of The Economist, and Australia ranks 10 of 113 in that group, and that's very, very secure, and we know that. It was interesting to me that they give the areas where Australia, or where each country has lost points. We're behind Singapore, which is bizarre. Singapore's number one, and it imports 100% of its food. It seemed to be very secure because it's cheap food, it's nutritious food, it's got decent stockpiles and reserves, it's got great strategies for investing offshore and making certain supply chains are all going to Singapore. At any one time, Singapore's got probably twice as much food onshore as it needs because it processes and re-exports, so it's considered to be very, very secure. But Australia actually lost points because of two things. One, the government investment in research and development was just a tiny bit deficient compared to the other countries, but also our food standards and food quality was less than those other countries over there, Ireland and the Scandinavian countries, etc. So we are secure. So that's, except if you haven't got a job. WA is a significant exporter of food compared to the population of Western Australia. I would like $1 for the number of times people have made comments like, we're going to feed the hungry world, that's what our agriculture does, and if the government does this, we're not going to be able to survive. And yeah, we are really a very, very small producer of anything in agriculture. The strength we do have is that we are a significant surplus of a number of products, particularly our grains. So the figures that I could get at the moment, we were between 0.7 and 1.3% of the world's wheat, which is up from last time I did this. I did this a few years ago and we were 0.6. We're probably 1 to 2% of canola, and of course that doesn't include the industrial rapeseed, etc. A couple of percent of barley. The only thing we're really significant of is apparel wool. We're down now. We used to be 6% and we're down to 5%, even though our production is way down. But we can't eat that. And the other products, beef and dairy and fruit and vegetables, and all very important to us and gives us a good diet, but incredibly small, 0.1%, 0.05%, very small. But the critical issue is that we do produce a significant and what has been a reliable export surplus. And it's surprising how few countries in the world are actually in that export market in any significant way whatsoever. So we're important to the food insecure places. Now, we have a lot of food and we have a lot of grain, and I won't be rude, but I was going to say there's a couple of farmers in the audience that are old enough to remember being brought up in the Depression, but that's probably not true. But they used to tell me the stories about eating boiled wheat and molasses. We can't get molasses in West Australia anymore because that's all closed down as well. But by and large, we don't eat much wheat, and very little barley is used in Western Australia. There's some in the grain feed industry. Most of our food it comes from supermarkets, and when you have a look at the people in the supermarkets, what they have in their trolleys, and walk around the shelves, it's absolutely stunning how little comes from Western Australia. And that's all I can say is stunning, because I knew it wasn't much, but when I actually did it seriously, it's almost nothing. So you can walk down whole aisles, you walk into the Woolworths and go to the left, and it's usually the frozen foods and the chilled foods. There's nothing there in those. You know, all the prepared meals, nothing from Western Australia. You can go down to the dairy section. Some of the milks are from West Australia. Occasionally a couple of brands of cheese. There's some yoghurt, but it doesn't take up much shelf space. All the rest is imported. Small goods, same. You know, the ham just about all comes from, and bacon and all that sort of stuff comes from Canada or Denmark. So you keep on going around the supermarket, and you really are starting to hang out to find something with a West Australian brand on. There's a bit of vinegar. There's some flour. None of the herbs and spices, the tinned foods, the packet foods. Yeah, it's just not there. So it's a bit of a wake up call. When you get to the groceries, the fresh food, it's a different issue. The majority of that comes from Western Australia in the meat section, but it is largely the lamb and the beef. Chicken, some of the chicken does, but the lamb and the beef is certainly West Australia. And Coles now have stopped importing sausages from Queensland. So all their sausages used to come from Queensland a couple of years ago. So we have, and the vegetables, the fruit and vegetables. A fair amount comes from Western Australia, particularly those that imports are banned because of disease. In the eastern states for biosecurity issues. So potatoes, plums, apples, all of those, they're all West Australian because they can't bring them in. If they did bring them in, it might be a different matter. So we have this enormous. We have this enormous distance that our food travels, and food miles are an issue. What causes it? You know, it's the ownership of food processing companies. They're big, they're global, they've got big factories. That they're not interested in small scale production in small places, and they're usually price competitive. Supermarkets have a buying policy where they really only want to deal with one person that supplies each product, and so they're not interested in accommodating a small product from Western Australia if they can get it for all the other states from the one place. And we of course want everything for the all year, which puts a constraint on them. So some things we do supply all year, and you know, sweet corn is something that we go up from Broome down to Albany, and it's a year-round supply, and all comes from Western Australia. I mentioned the food miles, and so that's the food miles is certainly an issue, and its use of carbon and as to the cost. But a critical issue is that there's very small stocks of food in Western Australia. The supermarkets may have a week's supply in their stores. Sometimes it might be less. Sometimes it's a little bit more. There is only one access route to Western Australia that trucks can come on, and that's the air highway. And most people here will recall that back in January this year, we had 12 days where that road was closed, and that started to impact what was on shelves. And COVID-19, the impacts on supply chains and distribution centres, etc. over east, has also had an impact on supermarket shelves. However, we are a very wealthy people in Western Australia, and in global terms, and what I've found is that anyone that's got money in their pocket usually is able to access food. There was a couple of classic examples of that. Is that Kuwait was blocked in 1990 by Iraq, complete blockade. No food could get in or out of that country while they were trying to take over Kuwait City. The people in Kuwait tell me there wasn't one day that you couldn't buy Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola is, I call it Islamic beer. They drink it when we drink wine and beer, and it was always available because they had the money to buy it, and God knows how it came in. Similarly, and I'm not going to pronounce that word, but if anyone wants to, they're quite welcome to. In 2010, I was in Oman, and I was working on the food supply chain there, and we had that big volcano in Iceland which blocked all air freight out of Europe, where a lot of stuff came, particularly from Holland to Oman. We had about 2 or 3 days where there wasn't much cheese on the shelf, and the next day it was all cheese from California, the US. So they had the money and they were able to get alternative supply chains very, very quickly. So our food is probably pretty secure in terms of being able to get it to us with any likely disruption. Now, I sort of started to think about, well, what are the things that are really going to affect our food security? The roads might be blocked for a while, but probably not a long time. The shipping routes might be affected, but the critical one that I think is climate change. And a few days ago, the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO published a state of the climate for 2020. And the southwest of WA, average temperatures have increased by 1.4% since 1910. April to October rainfall has declined by 16% since 1970 and 12% since the late 1990s. And May to June rainfall has declined by 20% since the 1970s. We all know that, but it really takes you to we know it in a qualitative sense, but to look at it figures like that, you think, well, this really is change. People have been talking about it for a while, and this is some work done a couple of years ago by DPIRD. There has been a significant shift in where the average rainfall lines are, the average rainfall ISO heights in Western Australia. So as we used to align those ISO heights with the cropping system and the farming system, we have seen since, in a statistical sense, since 1910 to 1999, a significant shift west in where our traditional cropping zones are. You can look at, there is so much data, and it does continue to astound me that we still have very significant people in the agricultural industries who are still climate denialists. The data is there, and it can be presented in thousands of ways. This is some that's been in a report that Bill Ryan and others produced recently, and basically that shows on the left-hand side is the area of the southwestern Australia that's had decile 10 rainfall. So it might only be a small area, around Denmark that got hammered with rain, but you can see that very, very, very small areas have actually, or decreasing areas have had a high rainfall incidence in recent years. And the one on the right-hand side is the decile 1, the 10% of lowest rainfall years. Significant increase. We saw again because we had the big droughts in the 1940s, but they didn't last anywhere near as long as this what we've got from 2010 on. The other thing that's important is you can look at the same sort of thing with decile 10 and decile 1 data for temperatures. The area that was affected by decile 1 temperatures, quite a lot of it up to 1970 would every few years there'd be a decile 1 temperature, and you get to the right-hand side, they're the decile 10 temperatures. So it's absolutely incontrovertible that it's getting warmer and drier. Now it shouldn't be much of a surprise. Arrhenius postulated this in 1903, and in fact they say that he demonstrated that carbon dioxide would have an effect upon the temperature of the Earth. And Keeling in the 1960s demonstrated we were putting more carbon dioxide up there, and it was enough to start to affect the Earth's surface temperature. The first real public exposure in Western Australia was in 1987, with Graeme organised the CSIRO bomb conference, which outlined the predictions as what they thought was going to happen to the climate. And the interesting thing about that is that what they said was going to happen, might happen, has basically been what has happened. Richard, George and I were interested in that at the time, and we got the proceedings and read the papers and did a bit of a summary for, we put it out as a farm note. And we basically, what they were saying was that the seasons would move, the systems would move south, and it would become warmer. We'd have reduced rainfall, and the figure then was 20%, but they didn't actually say by when, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we're pretty well there with that 20%. Some of the things, we were both working in resource management at the time, so we were a bit focused on resource management issues. And we thought that there'd be a decrease in the spread of salinity, especially in the low rainfall areas, a reduction in waterlogging, because that was a big issue in the 70s, particularly in the medium rainfall country that we're trying to crop, and a couple of other issues. Decrease in water supplies, well, we've certainly found that. What we, and I'm probably putting words in Richard's mouth that he might not have thought at the time, but I certainly didn't think that climate change was an ongoing process. I sort of was thinking of climate change, 20% increase in rainfall, bit of difference in seasonality, we'll be able to adapt to that. I didn't appreciate that we would continue to put enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that it would continue to change. And 2 degrees centigrade is, I think, a very optimistic outlook, and that's going to make things a lot different to what they are at the moment. So to me, that's a massive change. What we wrote in the last paragraph of that note was that farmers, land use planners, and the community in general need to be aware of the likely consequences and start to plan for change. Very, very, very unfortunately, we haven't done that. So the recent projections from Climate Change Australia, based on CSIRO and BOM work, is this just emphasising this continuation. It's going to get hotter and drier. And the interesting thing here is that I did some work recently up in the Gulf country, Western Queensland, and there's the CSIRO and BOM are completely uncertain as to what the future climate's going to be like there, except it's going to be more variable, because they can't separate with any confidence what's likely to happen. In Western Australia, it's the only place that they're very confident about their predictions. So the models are extremely confident. Now, we have, and by we, I'm including all of us with the farmers and the agricultural industry, have done a fantastic job of mitigating the effects of climate that we've seen, the climate change that we've seen. And a number of things technologies that were adopted, not necessarily to cope with climate, but to improve the production: direct seeding, better weeds management, investment in machinery capacity and technology, improved crop genetics. They've all allowed us to maintain a slight increase in our agricultural production. Now, we think that that's normal, and that's what we're doing, but it really is. It's in the face of that incredible change in the water that we've got. Now, this graph there, and I have to point out that there is an error, and I'll just talk about that very briefly in a second. But this is the grain and the wheat yields for the last decade. It's incredibly variable. And when you actually break that down and look at it in the port zones, it's even more variable, because it's so dependent on exactly when the rain falls. And if the rain falls at the right time, everyone's really happy. Now, no one was particularly happy in Western Australia this year. It was all looking really tough. We had a dry early spring. We then had a bit of rain, but in the last couple of days, UWA, the grains industry of WA, has put out a new forecast of 1 million tonnes above this figure. I did this graph 3 days ago. It's 1 million tonnes above that now, and it's 1 million tonnes above it which is great for West Australia and great for the farmers. It's 1 million tonnes because it has been cooler. We've had a very cool November, which has allowed the yield potential that was there to fill out a bit more, and the grains have been bigger. So that to me is just illustrating we're likely to have hotter temperatures, and if it had been hotter, it could have taken 1 million off that pretty quickly if we'd had an average year. So it's an important issue, and an issue that I was obviously unsuccessful in getting onto the agenda in 1988, and this is my last gasp at doing it with such an influential group of people. The flip side of which might affect what we do in agriculture, not necessarily our food security, is that there's going to be pressure on agriculture to reduce its emissions. We're about 13% of the emissions, which is not a lot, but it still is important. And the ruminant animals have become the bête noire of the climate change, anti-climate change people. And it's quite stunning to me how often I come across someone that's just turned into a vegan or a vegetarian because of climate change, and they don't want to contribute to it by eating meat. And I guarantee that everyone in this audience will know someone that has done that in the last 12 months. Generally young, generally women, less than 30, but a very significant change. It really came home to me the other day. Opened the West Australian, and about page 6 or page 7, we got this full-page advertisement for the IGA, and this is the top half of the page. The bottom half was the ingredients. Go plant-based at dinner tonight, or dinner time. So obviously, for them to put an advertisement like that, that was their sole advertisement on Fridays or Friday or Saturdays West. They're seeing a significant trend, and it's something that the agricultural industry is going to have to be aware of. There is, I'll go to the next page. The synthetic meats is a rapidly growing business, and these are products that are commercially available now: chicken and beef. Both of those made from the actual stem cells of the animal that are taken and then reproduced in a vat type system. So, as bad as we talked about 1988 about climate, in 1975 I talked a bit about synthetic meat because it was identified that there was a few products in the marketplace. The main players in those days were the big oil companies actually, or Rank Hovis McDougall, the big UK food business, and they were producing single cell protein. The oil companies were producing it from hydrocarbons. Textured vegetable protein was a big thing, and there were fungal proteins that they were messing about with and making products. The TVP was in the marketplace quite strongly. This has changed unbelievably in the last 5 years. The main players now are biotech startup companies in the US, and they're either producing the meat protein in single cells like yeast, where they've genetically modified it to produce that protein, or they're actually using stem cell tissue to produce the meat protein. And then they make this horrible hemoglobin and pour it in on top to give it a red colour. It's growing dramatically. The year-on-year growth is enormous, but it's still insignificant compared to beef consumption in the US. But it's just something that we need to be aware of that could change agriculture. I just wanted to talk briefly about agriculture research and development, and it really has changed a lot. And many people everywhere I go talk about the demise of the Department of Agriculture. But back in the The decline in the government agencies. It has changed, but the world back in the 1960s and 70s, when the department was tremendous in its agricultural research, was a different world. We had a farming population, many of whom had never farmed before, that took up farms in the 60s, and they were learning how to grow crops on light land. The Department of Agriculture was there with them, a couple of steps ahead sometimes, and maybe sometimes not. And the research was field research, and it was visible to farmers, and it really was a hellish on time. And someone like Norm Holst, and there's others in the room that played an enormous part in that. It really has changed dramatically. There's now about 100 private agronomists in the state, some giving full farm service, others just agronomy service. There's GRDC and the Rural Development Corporations have invested a lot in agriculture, and they drive the agenda. Farmer groups are doing their own research. Private breeding companies are doing research the department used to do. And the university sector is incredibly large and capable at the moment. It did surprise me when I looked into it, how many researchers there were, how many postgraduate students, how many postdocs and how many really viable centres there were across the universities. So I think there's more researchers in agriculture now than there ever has been in Western Australia. I know, by probably twice as much as there was in the 70s during the great days. But the challenge is that the agenda is driven from outside WA. University research is just funding driven, and it's incredibly short term. Mostly 3 years, sometimes 5, very, very occasionally 10. There's little coordination across the various sectors, and there is no room for strategic research thinking about what might fit into a future agricultural system. And on that, I just take, you think about the research that was done on lupins, and the research that was done on the viticultural industry in the southwest, where government research and development just kept on going until those things became successful. Never would have been funded within the current system because they were far too long term. And climate change is really something that just doesn't come into it. How are we going to manage the future in agriculture in Western Australia? I can't see anyone working in that space, and I can't see the existing system as it's set up delivering in that space. So there's both a food security and a salinity risk. I'll finish off now, but there's something that I get asked a lot, and it was suggested I briefly touch on today, not by Sadiq, but people still talk about salinity. And back when I was put into the position of Commissioner of Soil Conservation, the government considered salinity a major risk, and a lot of farmers did. It's a cancer. It was going to eat the countryside. We'd had a period of clearing. We'd had a period of high rainfall years. We had a lay farming system where half the country was in subclovers or medics that had roots of about 40 centimetres deep. It took us a month, if you were lucky, to get the crop in. After the rains, you had to plough it and work it back and then seed it. And a large part of the water just went past the roots of the clovers or the medics or the wheat, and it just recharged that groundwater system, which presented salinity on the surface. Today, we have 20% less rainfall. We have higher cropping intensity. Crops are planted on or before the rain, and the roots are there with the wetting front. Hardly, in some cases, no water gets past the root zone of the crops. So there is negligible groundwater accession occurring over most of the wheat belt. And in fact, there's negligible groundwater accession occurring in most of the hill catchments. So that's a real worry for future water supplies, not that there's much left anymore, because the groundwater is not getting the rainfall is not joining up with the groundwater, which then seeps into the creeks and the rivers, which then fills the dams. So it's a major issue in some places. But so salinity, to me, is not an issue at all for food security in Western Australia. I won't mention sheep because, just very briefly, that quite often people have said to me, as the agricultural moves west, the sheep can go back into the dry country and there'll be more sheep. But you're not going to produce many lambs out there on rain-fed pastures. You're not going to produce the quality wool, and wool is a product that's been under enormous pressure. It's only survives now because it's become a niche product, so you don't want any more wool. There are lots of positive things I'm not going to talk about, but just very briefly, this is work in Queensland that's in a semi-commercial stage with algae in saline water producing cattle feed. These are the closed system greenhouses, which there's none in Australia that I'm aware of, but quite becoming common in the Middle East now. Capture everything, as long as you've got the energy from the solar system to keep it going. The water is completely recycled. You take humidity out of the air, and unbelievable yields of vegetable crops. Sundrop supplies most of the truss tomatoes to Coles and Woolworths out of Port Lincoln. It's a variation on the closed system, except it's not a closed system. Massive mirrors that heat water here to boilers that produce power, which runs the glass houses, and a very big thing. And the other one is aquaculture, which is all there. So, very briefly in conclusions, and apologise if I've just gone a bit over time, but food security is an important issue for the world and for Western Australia. While we have secure food, I think there's some big risks about our future food production system, and it's going to be very important for us to really think about what our agriculture is going to look like when we're faced with at least 20 to 30 years of warming and drying environment. So thanks, Sadiq.
Thank you. Thank you, Graeme, and we will take some questions. Few questions which we identify and ask questions to one person. No.
I would like to say that I completely agree with the challenges that Graeme has pointed out to us, but I'd just like to add one thing, and that is that if we want to maintain any respect and sympathy for the natural systems of the world and the things that we think of in conservation, the problem is that much harder in our endeavours to cope with food production. We've changed the systems, as you pointed out here, continuous cropping, and over my life I've seen birds completely or almost completely disappear from the wheat belt because they don't live under those circumstances. Insects will disappear with them. And so this is going to be a difficult decision for people to be solved by population control, but it's the hardest problem of all.
Thanks, Norm. Just very quickly on that slide about the sheep, and we're going to have to do something with the lands that are no longer suitable for cropping. And it was interesting to see just a few weeks ago that Woodside had bought some wheat belt farms, and they're doing that with carbon offsets. But their intention is actually to recreate some of the biodiversity that was there. And one of the points I made that we shouldn't be worried about sheep, but perhaps we can put some resources into thinking about, well, how do you do that? What are you going to use that land for, and how are we going to recreate something that is stable? But the other point is it all possible, and is it going to make a difference? That's a critical issue with that. But it's in 2050, 11.7 million people that we're going to have from 7.8 at the moment.
If I promise not to say anything else after this, I think some of the problems of what we're doing now can be seen as having a serious impact. If you think of turning over the Amazon basin and the Congo basin to pulp production, what impact is that going to have on that system?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's one there.
I have a question with regards to the economic impact of food security, and obviously with Australia and Western Australia in particular being an exporter of agricultural items, that provides some economic security as we can turn into firming up our own supply chain. What is your view on food security of a region like, or a country like China, and the impact that their current situation with trading with Australia is going to have for that counter, if you like, of our food security?
I would answer that incredibly nervously because there's some people in the audience with a lot more knowledge of China than I have, although I've been there a few times. And there's also people who are intimately involved in Chinese grain trading at the moment. But I mean, the critical thing is it all fits together. At the moment, if China doesn't take grain from Australia, it's going to have to get it from somewhere else. It's not a massive importer, China. It's a massive producer. You know, it produces incredible amounts of grain, and it just really tops up with some products that it doesn't have. But the economic impacts here, obviously, if the price is disrupted in the long term, which, you know, personally I don't think it will be, it's going to be harder for people to keep farming, and that would the point I probably didn't really make, though it's I think it is in the slides, that, you know, agriculture is incredibly important to the economy of Western Australia. It is a very important economic driver, and historically, the sheep industry and the gold industry are what turned us into being a comfortable state or comfortable country. So it is critically important. So I probably haven't answered your question, but if anyone else wants to have a go at it.
Yeah, I would have a go. So you take, for example, the wine industry. So 10 years ago, probably it was a 100 million industry. And last year it was, this year, close to $2.82 billion industry. Of that, 1.8 billion goes to China. If you read today's news, that is going to be immediate disruption for the wine industry in Australia and all those boutique wine industry in Western Australia. China can get wine easily from France, Chile, Italy, and even from California. In fact, if you look at French wine, is the major supplier of wine to China.
Yes,
Then you take the barley, for example, the malt barley, majority goes to China. Where can they get? They can immediately get from Canada, which is supplying, and other places. So, Graeme, you're right. It is going to affect us more than China. China, food security or consumer preference will continue. This may be short term, but this is an important disruption. Stephen Hart.
Thanks. Graeme, you've seen a few fads as well as technological changes in your career. And the current one is called regenerative agriculture. And I wonder, I know it's hard to define, but I wonder what you think of it and place that in a historical perspective.
I was very amused to see the other day that there was a great big seminar of regenerative farming up in northern New South Wales. So obviously the bottom's fallen out in the marijuana market, and but how serious they are. But I mean, the regenerative farming is not that much different to what people like Yeoman were talking about back in the 50s. There's always been people that drop out of the commercial agricultural system and come up with something that works very well for their lifestyle and where their property is. But if you're trying to produce commercially into an export market, you haven't got a hope. So to me, it's a bit of jargon that's being thrown about to mean everything. I can't remember if you're involved, but I mean we had all the people down in the Kojonup area that were on dolomite quite a few years ago, and I think a lot of them are now regenerative farmers. So, and Yeah, different.
Question from there? Yeah.
I've been reading a little bit recently about what future foods that will be eaten in 50 years' time, and one of them is grasshoppers. I'm pretty certain that we will be they'll be on our menus, so we need that regenerative agriculture and all lands that they built to come back down from grasshoppers everywhere.
Yeah, they're a bit of a challenge because they're a bit episodic grasshoppers. They've got to have the right conditions to breed massively. But yeah, if you on the food we're going to be eating, one of the more difficult experiences I had was I had to talk about 15 to 20 years ago at a Pastoralists and Graziers conference about the future of agriculture, and I did the future of the pastoralism. I did touch on climate change, but it was at the Olive Farms winery. And on the stage was a big hogshead barrel, a 54-gallon barrel, wine barrel. And when I opened the thing, I leaned on it and I said, well, they're worried about other supplies of meat and meat price. I says, what you guys are going to have to be worried about in 50 years' time is your meat's going to come out of something like this. And, I'm not often right, but these meat substitutes are all being made in vats, stainless steel, but 4 times the size. Yeah, so it's God knows what in 50 years' time, but I think a lot of food is going to be manufactured because the technology's there. I mean, the biotechnology has made an enormous difference to many things, and it's going to make a difference to our food. Yep.
Thank you. Ashley, Heather.
Thank you, Steve. Graeme, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Bit of a trip down memory lane. I remember in my early years at the Department of Ag in the late 80s, I was your nominee on 4 or 5 local land conservation district committees.
Yep.
With the pleasure of going to these meetings every month, and that was the fervour around the encroaching salinity. And I was just observing to my wife the other day that it's funny that we don't talk about salinity anymore. And because at the time I remember I was thinking, well, hopefully I'll live long enough that we'll solve this problem and agriculture will be saved. And it sort of just disappeared, and I now understand why. And the second comment is I'd just like to underline the technology improvement you talked about with cropping. Is if we'd had the rainfall seasons that we had in the recent past 15 years ago, I suspect our clients would have grown sort of half the grain they're
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's just, we can't overstate the improvement in water efficiency that farmers have gained in the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
My question comes back to food security. You made the observation, Graeme, that a lot of the food we eat is processed, a lot of it's processed overseas. Where does that rate in the matrix of food security that you mentioned, where I think it's 13 out of 100 and something, and in terms of productive capacity to actually process the food that we grow, I sort of wonder if we can't import, how many weeks or how many months of food have we got that we are happy eating before we have to start eating, grinding our own wheat and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, molasses and boiled wheat. Yeah, I was talking about by imported product. I was including most of the eastern states. Most of our product comes from the eastern states, not overseas. So, but a lot of the ingredients, it doesn't matter what you look at. There's imported products. There's hardly anything that says 100% Australian on it. So I can't answer your question, but there's a lot more food in the country than there is in Western Australia. While we've still got the money and the capacity to ship stuff across the Nullarbor, we'll have plenty of food on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, I think we'll close. Thank you again. Please join me in thanking Graeme for that insightful. He gave us a history. We talked about some of the current status, and then futuristic look, including the climate change, and then touched a bit about the future R&D. I think the grains industry, agriculture will be still there. A lot of those modern techniques, broad acre crops, you cannot grow in glass houses, so intensive production system will supply some of them, but broad acre agriculture. The question about the regenerative agriculture, Steve, we have 27 million hectares in the southwest corner. Of that, we have probably 12 million hectares. We need to bring that down to 10 million, maybe 8 million, and then we produce the same or more. That's a trend. So we can get some of the land to the so-called trees and some of the other habitats. The other point, I think Graeme's batch here, I just did some digging. When you finished your undergraduate honors program, there were some incredible people here. One is Graeme Robertson, Michael Perry, Craig Peterson, Bob Nelson, and a couple of others from that batch who then went from the university, then established themselves in the leadership in agriculture in Western Australia and other places. I think what is needed again, Graeme, is the integration ability, and that is something lacking in the university system, where we have now been too much focused on certain things, and we're who can look at the bigger picture and then bring up some solutions for the future, particularly the climate change and the future of agriculture in Western Australia. So once again, thank you. Graeme.
Thank you. Yep. So, I've actually produced a 7-page paper which is a bit more expansive than this. Yeah.
So Graeme says that he has kindly produced his thoughts into a paper, and we're happy to PDF and distribute and upload it on our website. Today's lecture is already recorded by Robertson, and that will come into our YouTube tomorrow. That's right. Yes, tomorrow it will come. And so that comes to